Pay close attention. The news you are about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, in the news this week, Katan, we recently saw how Russia developed a hypersonic missile. Now, China is flexing their military muscles. They have a new weapon that they're introducing. We're also going to talk about the truth about the Middle East, why the U.S. has so much involvement in that area there. We have those details. And also, John Bolton. John Bolton has some pretty strong fighting words for Iran, definitely not making peace with Iran with what he says. We'll cover those things. But first, it's flu season. Now, the United Press International recently reported that there have been between 6 to 7 million people diagnosed with the flu so far for the 2018-2019 season. The Centers for Disease Control says that about half of those who came down with the flu had sought medication treatment. Now, U.S. hospitals in 13 different geographic areas share their data with the CDC. Currently, flu-like illnesses are still high in 15 states and New York City.
Well, the last coalition airstrikes in Syria left 24 civilians dead, and Syria calling on the United Nations to stop the U.S.-led attacks on their country. The Syrian Foreign Ministry made the request in 2 separate letters addressed to the UN Secretary General in the presence of the UN Security Council. In the letters, Damascus described the airstrikes as illegal and accused Washington and its allies of disregarding international law.
Well, furthermore, Syria's foreign ministry said the only purpose for the attacks are to create conditions under which Daesh terrorists can continue surviving. Now, in the most recent airstrikes by the U.S.-led coalition in Deir ez-Zor province, 10 civilians were killed, including 4 children. Now, just one day earlier, 11 more civilians also died as a result of the same kind of attack.
And sad to say that it seems like in a lot of these situations, it seems like children are also taking just as much of the brunt of these attacks as the adults, if not in some cases more so. Well, while the coalition claims they are targeting battlegrounds with their air raids, the aftermath shows a different reality. Homes destroyed and families devastated by the loss of their loved ones. And of course, these latest bombings are just a continued pattern that has been taking place in Syria and Iraq since 2014. Now, in total, the U.S.-led forces have carried out thousands of such bombardments in the name of fighting Daesh.
Well, Washington claims that civilian casualties in Syria number less than 1,000 victims total. Activists say the death toll is 10 times higher than that. Now, human rights groups have even accused the U.S. and its allies of committing potential war crimes due to the lack of discrimination when bombing targets. Well, so far, Washington acknowledges its attacks in Raqqa have caused the deaths of 77 civilians between June and October 2017, but Amnesty International says the admission is just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, in a recent interview with Euronews, Orly Halpern, a freelance journalist based in Jerusalem, talked about Israel's involvement in Syria and Prime Minister Netanyahu's political future. While she could not confirm that Israel had actually carried out airstrikes in Syria, she did say Israeli newspapers are assuming that they did go ahead, and the analysis agree with that assessment as well.
Well, in one report from Newsweek magazine, Hezbollah officials were likely targeted due to the fact that some reported injuries during one of the airstrikes. Now, Halpern said, quote, a very expansive strike in numerous places around Syria.
While former Israeli officials are denying Hezbollah being targeted, Halpern went on to say no one is denying that Israel attacked Syria. So, Therefore, everyone is making the assumption that's what took place. The timing on this is somewhat interesting, taking place just 1 week after the U.S., Israel's big ally, announced they were withdrawing from Syria.
Well, all of this coming just a few months after Syrian forces downed a Russian plane by accident. Now, the incident took place because of an Israeli airstrike, and since then, Putin has been putting pressure on Israel to slow down their attacks. So, Halpern says that these new airstrikes are a sign that Israel is going to continue, quote, business as usual in Syria.
But Israel is facing a time of possible turbulence. The prime minister called for early elections when he realized he couldn't pass a bill because he was losing his majority government. Well, elections will be in April, and Halpern says the prime minister is basically fighting for his political survival.
On top of this, Netanyahu is facing possible indictment charges in 3 separate corruption cases. Israeli police have released their findings in a report, and now everyone is waiting to see what the Attorney General will do. Now, Netanyahu's political career is literally hanging in the balance. Halpern says that there's a possibility the Attorney General could say, "I'm not indicting him. I don't think there's enough evidence." Then Netanyahu will be clear ahead of the election.
A longtime prime minister may be holding out hope that the attorney general will postpone his decision. If, however, he doesn't and decides to indict Netanyahu, the prime minister would go to the polls as a serious suspect. So right now, everyone is just waiting to see what he will decide.
Well, as we talked about, Katan, Russia coming out with their latest hypersonic missile, 27 times the speed of sound.
Right.
Now, China has also developed what they're calling a mother of all bombs, a non-nuclear, but one of the largest non-nuclear bombs that there is. We're going to turn to our field correspondent, Larry McGee, who has the details. Larry, what is China saying about this new bomb, and have they performed any tests on it so far?
There is a battle going on to maintain the petrodollar against the emergence of the Petro Yuan and the reestablishment of the ancient Silk Road. The tussle between Beijing and Washington has escalated from a war of words to economic dueling, and now the conflict is being weaponized. This week, China is making headlines after one of its largest weapons producers showcased a Chinese version of America's most powerful non-nuclear bomb. The American version has been nicknamed the mother of all bombs, or MOAB for short, and caught the world's attention after it was test dropped in Afghanistan to demonstrate its potential for destruction. The Chinese version, which was reportedly dropped and detonated in an undisclosed location, is said to rival the U.S.'s model by being equally as destructive but lighter and therefore easier to transport. The weapon can produce a blast reportedly capable of destroying fortified ground targets such as reinforced buildings, bastions, and defense shelters. And whereas the U.S.'s version requires an American cargo plane for delivery, the Chinese model can reportedly be dropped from any of its aircrafts. Along with that, Beijing is also dropping accusations against the U.S. for violating international law. This follows after an American destroyer sailed within close proximity to islands in the South China Sea, which Beijing believes to be its own. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Liu Kang delivered a statement condemning the move as an infringement on China's sovereignty and stated furthermore that the action worked to undermine peace, stability, and order in the South China Sea. The spokesperson asserted that Beijing firmly opposes such moves, and he urged the U.S. to cease from further provocations, before also stating that China will continue to take the necessary measures to ensure its safety and sovereignty. The U.S. has reportedly stated that the exercise was a part of an operation designed to counter Beijing's excessive plans in the South China Sea. The idea of excessiveness may have something to do with the fact that the possession of the territory in question is actually a matter of dispute. While China claims possession of the area and has built islands within the waters on which to establish bases, Vietnam, Taiwan, Brunei, the Philippines, and Malaysia have all also claimed measures of ownership, and the disagreement has been an ongoing fight. The United States is also in the fray, calling the disputed territory international waters and working with their allies in the Pacific to pressure Beijing into relenting. Due to heightened tensions, Taiwan is reported to be readying its military in the event of an all-out clash, while China has reportedly deployed its supersonic nuclear missile to check and counter the U.S. destroyer that recently arrived in the sea. Though the Asian powerhouse made headlines a while ago for resuming relations with what some believe to be the Holy See, it has apparently decided to support one of the Vatican's biggest competitors instead. Please have a look at this video as we return back to Katan and Jeff.
Well, it's interesting to see how these big players, the United States, Russia, and China, are always trying to bring bigger weapons to the table to outdo or at least equal what the other country is doing. But also with China, it's interesting. They're not saying you can't have these different religions
practice
here.
Islam.
Yeah, just let it
incorporate it into our Chinese style.
Yep, our socialism, our standards. Well, so much is taking place in the Middle East, and as many of you, our viewers, remember, General Wesley Clark came out with a kind of a shocking statement to some not that long ago, a few years ago, about the U.S.'s plans to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. Well, the next series of articles actually deals with that very thing, Iran, and how the U.S. is working to complete that very task.
Well, the U.S. is moving to Plan B regarding the Iran deal, which they are leaving, and planning to put more sanctions into effect on the country. Now, John Bolton said that the U.S. isn't going to rely on paper promises, but instead rely on real performances to stop Iran from getting real deliverable nuclear weapons. Now, the objective is to get Iran to give up its enrichment program and nuclear program, and the U.S. and its allies are going to meet to target Iran's other maligned activities, including its continued support of terrorist groups.
Well, President Trump and his national security advisor, John Bolton, seems to be on different pages regarding the U.S. troops coming home. In a recent video, President Trump said, "We won against ISIS and have beaten them badly, and now it's time for our troops to come back home." Well, the Pentagon said the president's orders will be carried out in 30 days. A day after that announcement, Jim Mattis, Defense Secretary, resigned in protest. But Bolton says that withdrawal would only occur if certain conditions are met.
Well, some of those conditions are the protection of U.S. allies in the region and the complete defeat of ISIS, and that there's not a timetable on the withdrawal of troops. And now the president is saying there was never a deadline. An initial deadline that was due to expire in a week, but not being able to leave until they defeat ISIS pushes that withdrawal back months, even years.
Well, regarding protection of U.S. allies in the region, Israel is one of those allies that the U.S. is concerned with. Bolton spoke at a press conference with Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, reassuring Israel of the U.S.'s commitment to the country in the defeat of ISIS, and of course to make sure that not only in defeating them, that the group will not spring up again.
Well, in Iran, protests have been increasingly growing violent as peaceful demonstrators take to the streets. Now, President Trump tweeted in response to Iran's shutdown of the internet in Iran by saying, Iran, the #1 state of sponsored terror with numerous violations of human rights occurring on an hourly basis, has now closed down the internet so that peaceful demonstrators cannot communicate. Not good.
Bolton spoke to Fox News concerning the U.S.'s thoughts on the latest round of protests, saying that these protests are different from the ones in 2009, where the concern was if Mahmoud Ahmadinejad won that election illegally, or as they said, by fraud. But this time, it's whether the regime survives or not, making the protests that much more dangerous to the Ayatollahs. And of course, this raises the stakes. But he continued, President Trump has made a huge difference compared to President Obama by supporting the protesters, but we need to do more.
Well, we do not want to make the same mistake that the U.S. did in 1956, calling opposition out in Hungary and standing by while watching the Soviet tanks crushed the opposition, as well as in 1991 when we called for Saddam to step down and stood by while Saddam and his regime massacred thousands of innocent civilians. Now, Bolton concluded by saying that we can do more by putting more pressure on the regime, by applying more sanctions, getting out of the nuclear deal, and providing financial support to the opposition if they want it. Our goal should be regime change in Iran, he concluded.
Well, in fact, Bolton has been extremely steadfast in regards to the Iranian regime and responding to threats made by the country. In fact, take a look at this next video, a compilation of some of those statements to that effect.
There is a viable opposition to the rule of the Ayatollahs, and that opposition is centered in this room today. I have said for over 10 years since coming to these events that the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullahs regime in Tehran. The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. But our goal should be regime change in Iran. Yes, there will indeed be hell to pay.
Gatan, that's pretty bold statements by Mr. Bolton saying that we're going to celebrate, the U.S. will be celebrating in their capital city by the year 2019. And, you know, of course, we are in 2019 now. However, you know that still, if they're working towards that goal, there's certainly not going to be any peace here between these two nations. I mean, those are some pretty strong words from Mr. John Bolton.
Yeah, and as we've seen previously, you know, John Bolton has been steadfast on his goal of taking down the Iranian regime, and coupled with what we just mentioned not too long ago, but also have seen in times past with General Clark's statements were concerning the U.S. and taking out certain countries, you know, Iran being on that list there.
Right, the last one that they mentioned was Iran.
Yeah, and so, and it's been going on for several years now, and it doesn't seem to be letting up. Even when it seems that the U.S. was winning, all right, well, let's go ahead and pull on out. No, we're going to go ahead and stay there and stay the course. So,
right, and even what we covered in our last broadcast, where the troops that they're so-called withdrawing from Syria, they're just relocating to Iraq, and now they're saying that this may be just the staging point to attack Iran. So, you know, it's not really a withdrawal, it's just let's relocate them over here. Yes, I guess you could call it a withdrawal from that country,
right,
but not coming home, so to speak, just going over here to Iraq to where they can be right next door to Iran.
That's right.
Well, lastly, let's take a look at this clip from a speech where former General Wesley Clark comments on why the U.S. involves itself in the affairs of other countries, and most of you won't be surprised as to the reason why. Take a look.
The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa. The problem is the opposite. We keep asking for people to intervene and stop it. And there's no question that the presence of petroleum throughout the region has sparked great power involvement. Whether that was the specific motivation for the coup or not, I can't tell you, but there's always been this attitude that somehow we could intervene and use force in the region.
Now, what the former General Wesley Clark said there was that was right after 9/11 attacks on the U.S., where these 7 countries in 5 years were named. And now we're down to the last one, Iran. But interestingly, he said we wouldn't have that involvement if it wasn't for the oil.
Right.
So you see here now the underlying reason of the U.S. being there in the Middle East all has to do with oil.
Yeah, and then interesting, enough that he said, in certain areas in Africa, there's no involvement. Even though there are skirmishes and wars and things like that taking place, there's no involvement with the U.S., where the U.S. says, in these other countries, we're coming here to kind of help the people out, to bring about democracy in these areas, to get out the regime. But there's a greater underlying thing, and oil is the reason, and many people know of that. In fact, Yisrael Hawkins and the House of Yahweh has foretold about these very things that actually are written in the Holy Scriptures thousands of years ago. In one of the books that he wrote in the 1970s, 1976 in fact, Mark of the Beast Volume 1, and of course later Volume 2, describes the details that were actually shown in Daniel and Revelations concerning the time period that we're in right now. And so if you'd like to find out more about these prophecies in the time that we're in, known as the last generation, contact the House of Yahweh, and when you do, don't forget to request your free copies of the monthly newsletter and the prophetic word. And also don't forget to look and find out how you can obtain those copies of the Mark of the Beast and Volume 1 and Volume 2 and Birth of the Nuclear Baby books. I believe you can actually find those on, you're going to mention the Yisrael Says program.
Right.
And that information is there for you to find out those prophecies, how they were foretold, and how they pertain to our time right now.
Well, to contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. You can visit them on any of their websites, Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, Yahweh'sBranch.com. You could also visit our website at YPNnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can do so by emailing info@yahweh.com. Any international calls, you can call the number that's on your screen. And as Katan mentioned here, the 2 programs that you can check out, the Yisrael Says program by going to YisraelSays.com, or the Ask Yisrael program by going to AskYisrael.com, where you can search those 2 books that Katan mentioned, the Mark of the Beast, Volumes 1 and 2, and also Birth of the Nuclear Baby, to find out more about the prophecies that Yisrael Hawkins is bringing forth.
All right, well, don't go anywhere. Get your pen, your paper, and of course your Holy Scriptures to follow along, because up next is Yisrael Hawkins. For all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.